pre-submitted?
Sure.
Hey.
Hello. It is January 17th. Is it just me, or does the holidays feel like they were like ages ago?
Oh, there you are. Yeah, no, it's crazy because every time I look, it's like January 17th, but I swear to Christmas, New Year's, and everything was 7 months ago. Like
Yeah,
that's
same. I just looked down like January 17th. That can't be right. Like if that means we just had the holidays. It's like, oh my gosh, time flies. So good to see you all. So good to see you, Chris. I want to hear some updates about you and life and work and how it's going. And I want to hear, I want us to spend a little bit of time today just chatting and talking about what we think is happening in the OCD world and having kind of a candid conversation between each other. And then, of course, we're going to get to questions. Today, our goal, you guys, is that we'll chat, give some hot topics, talk through them together, and then we will get to both pre-submitted questions and live questions. So please make sure you tell us who you are, where you're joining from in that right-hand pane, and give us questions, give us thoughts, give us things you want us to cover so that we can make sure we address that today. As always, our live streams are not intended to replace therapy. You should have your own individual therapist for individual therapy questions and support. And IOCDF or the live streams are not a crisis line. If you're feeling unsafe or suicidal, please call 988 or your local emergency, depending on where you live. So excited to have everyone here. Let's just hop in. It's kind of like, I don't know if, well, you're in California, so you don't count, but our weather is freezing. So I know that there's been this snowstorm going across the country and everyone's feeling cold, but we're so cold in Houston. We're like, it was 19 when I woke up yesterday. So I know.
I don't know what that is.
I know. We're so jealous of you and your weather. But okay, let's just kind of jump in, Chris. But I want to hear a little bit about what do you feel like? Oh my gosh, Matt, -1 in the UK. Oh goodness, I feel so bad for you. But stay warm, stay inside, and just keep listening to these live streams to make you happy.
Joseph is from Southern California, and Joseph, we are at 60 degrees right now, and I'm freezing. So then when I see you and Matt talk about it, I'm like, oh no, I need to not say anything.
Y'all are so ridiculous. 19 would be a heat wave, Amy. So funny. I'm sorry. I rubbed it in. I'm complaining. Okay, Chris, tell me, I want to hear from you. What do you feel like right now are the hot topics in the OCD and mental health world that you're hearing and that you're experiencing clinically? And let's talk through them. Let's chat.
Yeah, you know what? I think where I always get my source from is I run 2 support groups, and I always like to kind of pick their brains, see what they're talking about, see what's impacting them. And the 2 conversations that we've had these weeks is the first one is about this concept of really kind of, actually there's 3. One of them, it's funny because you actually brought up, but then what? Yeah.
One of them take notes because you're giving me 3.
It's funny because one of them you actually had brought up too, but one of my clients brought up. So I'll do that one last because you already kind of talked about it. But the first one is this idea of really punching first, right? There's a client in the group that's a boxer, and he was talking about one of the things that's helped him with his OCD treatment is punching first, meaning I'm going to wake up today. I know I have OCD. I know I'm going to have thoughts, and I know I'm going to have urges to do compulsions. If I go through my day in this kind of defensive, please don't attack me. Okay, I'm triggered. Let me do an exposure to respond. That's not a way to live. You're constantly in a state of fear and defensiveness. And so what we really talked about yesterday in my adult group is this concept of punching first. So for instance, if you have hit and run OCD, when you wake up and are heading to work, drive by that school or that busy marketplace on deliberately. And that way you're purposely, you still need to get to work. It's a values-based exposure, but by you taking the leadership, you're not driving to work kind of in defense mode, holding your breath, white knuckling it. And then somebody comes out and you're like, okay, I'm not going to drive around the block. It puts you always in this kind of scared state, which OCD prides on. So we were talking about that. I think the second one is the concept of additional feelings in OCD outside of just the standard anxiety. So I noticed that when a lot of my clients, specifically with taboo intrusive thoughts, they may feel anxiety, but the things that are really getting them is definitely the guilt, the shame, the loss of identity, the disgust in self, feeling like them as a person has no worth. They don't deserve anything because they're having these thoughts about harming children or having thoughts about harming a family member or having sexually aggressive thoughts about classmates. And so we were really talking about that. And then the final step is sort of what you were talking about the other day, is this concept about everybody was saying, like, the people, because we have some people that have gotten better that still come to support the newbies, and they were saying, like, when you finally realize, like, your therapist can't be the one to save you. They're there to guide you in the beginning, but eventually you have to get to a point, whether it's residential, whether it's individual sessions, et cetera, is like you really should be learning how to take ownership of it, so that, you know, no matter where you are, whether you're in treatment or out of treatment and kind of solo or seeing a therapist, because you're the one that's really learned how to like direct your own care, you always have a sense of like calm and comfort because you know you can do it solo. Treatment's always there. You should always get touch-up sessions if needed, but at least you're the one directing it. So those were like the three big community topics that came up, that we've been discussing. So I don't know if you have heard those, if those are new, if you like them, if you hate them.
No, I don't like them at all. No, I like them, of course. Yeah, no.
Well, you know what? Kimberly Rockwell Evans, who I admire and love and look up to and all the work she does, likes my points, Liz. So I'm on a high right now.
Hey, you know what? As long as Kim does, then it's all good. No, so I love this. So one thing that I wanted to talk about today that I've been witnessing a lot, both here at the clinic and in our residential program and just in general, is this concept that we've talked about before and that I lived for like a decade of my life, where I settled for my OCD being good enough. So like did ERP to get me functional. And I recently had an outpatient who told me, you know, my OCD is down to 30% of where it was when I started. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's amazing. She's like, yeah. And this is usually where I stop in treatment. Like typically in the past, this was always when I got to where it was like quiet enough that it was like at 30%. And I was like, oh, like I have so much of my life back. I can go live my life. I can do these things. But I'm like, you know, there's that 30, but it's a 30%, but who cares compared to 100? That's great. The problem with that is that that 30% always grows, and that 30% becomes obviously 100% again, but also you're still leaving fear there. And so one thing I've been hearing a lot at the clinic here is a lot of residents saying things like, well, you know, I was really triggered by a conversation another patient was having. And I'm like, tell me more about that. And they're like, well, you know, I got that part of my OCD to be quiet. And like now they were talking about it. Now I'm worried it's going to be loud again, or that I'm going to be triggered by it. And like, I just wish I could avoid them. And my answer to that is like, wow, what a perfect blessing, like that's happening here, that you're having this exposure. But what I want us to recognize is that if there's any piece of us where the way we're saying we're managing our symptoms are that, oh, we got it quiet enough, I want us to be weary. So like, that's when I want us to actually, I want you to make it loud. I want you to make sure that there is no part of recovery where you have this mentality that like, oh, I can be in recovery as long as I don't have to deal with this thing, or as long as this doesn't get louder. You know, I'm going to have a family session this week with a family, and my intention when I talk to them is that I want to make sure that, like, sometimes I think what we do for OCD treatment is that we get to this place of like, oh, I can like push through and like do what I'm supposed to do, and I'll just make OCD quiet enough. And I think from a family perspective and an individual perspective, sometimes that feels like treatment. And there's a piece of it where like that is treatment. You're doing exposures, right? You're moving through, you're doing exposures. That's great. But if we're not actually addressing what's at the core, and we're not allowing ourselves to get quiet and to actually face our fear, it's just always one trigger away from being really bad again. Like I used to always say that I was one trigger away from relapsing, or I was one trigger away from inpatient again, or residential, or whatever it might be. And now I look back and I'm like, I wish somebody would have told me back then, like, Liz, you don't have to be there. You don't have to live your life being one trigger away from relapsing. Like, you can actually live your life where you're just like one trigger away from having to face something and like not being afraid of a trigger, you know? And so that's something that I've just been hearing a lot, and I've seen it for advocacy. I've seen it across the board, where there's this belief that like, let's just try to get our OCD quiet enough and let's just like survive while still struggling with OCD. And that if we get there, that's good enough. And I want to push you guys to understand that you can do that last 30%. You can get to a place of freedom. You can get to a place where you know that there will not be a conversation, there will not be a topic, there will not be a trigger or an event that is too hard for you to face. That doesn't mean it won't ever be triggering again. Like Chris, I'm sure at times you still have triggers. I still at times get triggered. But the way I can respond to that trigger, and I can stop that trigger from becoming my next OCD struggle, and instead it's just a one-time trigger that I had to face, that to me is the place of freedom.
Yeah, well said. I always call it the 75% recovery. Once people get to that 75%, it can be dangerous in the sense that most of their OCD is managed. The panic, the pure terror part of it is handled, and there's still about 25%. But because somebody feels like comforted, they feel like they can function, they're back at work, etc., they start to kind of walk away from recovery. And what I always hear from people that have to get back into therapy is they'll say, I didn't really take it there with my clinician. I was kind of like 75%. And then when they go back to treatment, I think that's why I was always successful with not having these huge relapses, is I told my therapist, I was like, I want us to finish where I come to session and you're like, Chris, I have nothing left for you. So I agree with you. It's that taking it all the way. I think on a bigger kind of like cognitive scale, one of the things that I really liked, I think I first saw the concept by Reed Wilson at a IOCDF conference, is like once you start to learn the mechanics of OCD, what it's doing, how it's working, all of that, then new things that pop up start to seem silly. So for me, right, like if I'm in a situation where something kind of like pops up and I start to get myself really, really worked up, a lot of times for me it's perfectionism, especially around events that I put on and I want it to go well, and I'm starting to get very invested in everything. I start to notice the way that I feel, the emotions that I have, the thoughts that I have, the honing in, and all the different ways that I've altered from being normal Chris into this kind of like more like tight panic state. And I'm like, OCD is present in this room right now. What's going on? And it's typically me fussing and worrying about, like, for me, if I'm being candid, I forgot a comma in a flyer, right? And I thought, okay, we have to fix the flyer, I have to resend it out, I have to put an apology. And I'm like, this is so stupid. But if I don't realize the mechanics of OCD, I'm going to treat it important. So I think there's so many aspects. That's why we always have like all these ideas for conferences and stuff, like you've talked about with ownership going all the way. And then this concept of just know the mechanics, know how OCD is working, know how it gets you, so that you're not keep chasing triggers anymore. You get to a point. I think going back to the client that you were talking about the triggering conversations, one thing I tell everybody, and I try to, like, you and I and John did a talk at the conference about rebranding ERP. What I try to talk to people about is like, life is triggering. There's going to be movies that there's a scene, there's going to be conversations when you're grocery shopping. You want to embrace that. That's our opportunity to like really lean in and say, I want to get to a point that no matter what somebody in line at the grocery store is saying, it doesn't faze me, and I just don't react, and I don't care.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. It's again, I started to like call it this bring it on mentality of like, instead of this like, oh, please don't do that to me, or like, I hope I don't have to face that. I want you to approach every day with like, bring it on, OCD. Like, I can't wait to see what you try to throw at me today and where you try to get me or like throw me off, right? Because if we have that mentality, we're actually like already showing that like we're going to stand up to OCD. We're not afraid of OCD. We're here to like stand up and to respond, versus, oh my gosh, I hope that I don't have to face that. I hope it doesn't come up. Like, guess what? It's going to come up and it's going to throw you off even more. So yeah. Love it. All right, let's go to some live questions. I know you've got pre-submitted, so we'll hop back and forth. So I'll start with live at 10:46 my time, Brennan. When doing ERP, is it a must to embrace and internalize the emotions to have success? Or is it possible by simply accepting what you're experiencing? As in accepting that the intrusive thoughts and emotions are there and how they make you feel without having to internalize and embrace them. It feels wrong welcoming this monster into my being. So these are around blasphemous, taboo, and sexual intrusive thoughts.
Yeah. So this is actually a great topic. Something that came up in my support group yesterday is somebody was saying they have POCD and they're working, unfortunately, because of insurance restrictions for individuals. They're working with a therapist that doesn't seem pretty trained in ERP. And this is their same question, is like, do I have to like accept these feelings? Do I have to be okay with maybe being a pedophile? Is this and that? That is not the treatment. The thing that's going to happen is you're going to have experiences based off of the thoughts and the triggers that you have. And so when we have blasphemous or taboo thoughts, we're going to be triggered. So for instance, let's say a client has a young child, right? And she's starting to have these intrusive thoughts about harming her child. The clinician should not be sitting there and saying like, awesome, you should have these feelings. You could kill your kid. Great. Like, learn to accept it, learn to like it, learn to embrace that, right? That's not what we're doing here. We got to take a step back and say, look, because you have OCD, you are somebody that really loves and wants to protect your child. And OCD is preying on that. It recognizes that that is a trigger spot for you. And so it thinks it's helping you by saying, why don't you be super, super sure that you're going to be protective of your child? And let's look at you for a minute. Is there a possibility that you could harm your child? And then people with OCD make the mistake of treating that as like a real concern. And so they start to kind of ruminate, they start to check, they start to avoid, etc. Those natural feelings are going to come up. What I try to teach my clients is like those feelings that you have are not on a real organic experience. So for instance, if you got married and you had these great feelings and these great sensations, those were organically your own. If you're having all this caution and this fear around hurting your kid, that isn't an organic experience. You haven't done anything to your child. Your brain is really just fixating on a very rare possibility, and sometimes we treat it too much like a possibility. So what I did for my own recovery and what seems to be working for clients is recognizing to change your relationship with your thoughts and your feelings. No longer sitting there and embracing those feelings and saying they must be true. We talk in CBT about emotional reasoning. We do not want to base our safety and our situation on how we feel when we've been triggered, because that trigger is organically not our own. So what you are having in that case is you are going to experience something and you want to change your relationship with that. You want to be able to have those emotions and say, look, these are not my own. I'm not going to own them. I'm going to put them back on OCD. OCD needs to take ownership for what it's doing. And I'm going to go back. That's why I love acceptance and commitment therapy. I'm going to go back to living a values-based life today. What things do I have going on? What things am I going to re-engage in? I'm not going to spend the rest of today fixating on the feelings that I'm experiencing.
Love that. Could not agree more. All right. So many questions. You guys, I love y'all. There's people from Nathan from Moscow. We've got the UK. We've got Holland. We've got SoCal, New Jersey, you name it. This is so cool. So cool. Okay. L. Allen at 1108. My husband has real event OCD and he doesn't know how to handle it. Do you have any tips for this subtype? Compared to contamination OCD, it's much less practical and more in the head, if you know what I mean. I'd be happy to take this first, Chris, and then you can, because I want to talk a little bit about this. So I want to just say that real event OCD, scrupulosity, contamination, they're actually all the same. So many times I'll hear people say, well, scrupulosity is different, or contamination is different, or intrusive thoughts, so like sexual or whatever intrusive thoughts that are more in our head and less rituals is different. It's actually all the same. And what Chris was saying earlier about one of the things he learned from Reed Wilson is that if we can see OCD as a whole for what it is, we're less zoomed in on our specific trigger and more about being able to see it as a whole, we actually can treat it all the same way. And so that's what we're saying is that can you see across the board how the mechanisms and everything are actually the same, but how OCD is trying to pull you in. And when you can do that, the outcomes will be so different and so incredible. So with real event, though, I do want to talk about something. There is times where, even scrupulosity or anything, where there's something that happens and then OCD takes a hold. And sometimes within that, I want to just say this, and this is a big exposure for many people, so I'm warning you, there's an event or a situation or an answer that sometimes people do have to make a decision on. I want you to think about that. So sometimes there is a real event that happens and there's a decision that we still need to make that sometimes because of OCD, we avoid making a decision and then we live in limbo and we're trying to treat real event, but we're kind of stuck. But part of the exposure would actually be to make a decision. So I want to give an example of that. So let's pretend that in the past, I had a real event with a friend where there was something that happened and it turned into an argument or a situation that happened that then I got really triggered by and I quit talking to my friend. And let's pretend that my OCD was very much involved and something was contaminated or whatever happened, right? But like there was a real event that happens where my friend and I no longer talk. And then I started to have OCD triggers around what if she's upset with me? What if I did something wrong? What if something happens? But there was truly like a fight or an argument that happened. We are going to treat this as OCD in the sense that what we're going to do is be able to say, okay, like who knows what I did or didn't do and I need to move on. But if there's a piece of me that I'm truly like, yeah, but Chris, there's really an unresolved issue here too. Like, I actually do want to reach out to that friend and apologize for the event so that I can then move forward. Chris and I might say, okay, let's figure out how to make that decision without OCD making that decision. Where what would Liz do? And I might say, you know what, I really do want to text that friend and like apologize for something that I did, because that's actually important to me to take ownership, and I don't want to treat it all as OCD. So in the past, I can remember that I used to sometimes have people say or not people, myself being people, but in the past, I used to want to label everything as OCD. Like, oh, well, it's all OCD, so I don't need to respond at all to her. When it was like, well, no, but there's a piece that like, I actually do want to reach out to her. That friendship is important to me, and I do want to take ownership of it. So I don't want to avoid everything, because that's just avoiding any anxiety also because of my OCD. And so the exposure was actually to reach out, which was harder, because then it was like, well, what if she doesn't respond? What if she is still upset? But if the value is that, no, I do want to reach out and close that loop, I'm going to do that. And then we're going to treat the rest as OCD. Another example is medical stuff, right? People with health anxiety. Like, I can't treat it purely as health anxiety and OCD if you haven't been medically cleared first. And so does that mean I'm going to say, go ahead and go to 20 doctors and get 20 opinions? No, we're going to make a decision of like, okay, you're going to go to one doctor, you're going to get a decision, and we're going to move forward. But this is how you're going to go to that doctor and not let it be OCD dictated. And what I mean by that is, we're not going to ask reassurance. We're going to set really clear goals. We're going to make sure we have a clear plan. But maybe you do need to go to that doctor first to get an answer, so that then we can treat it as OCD. So I say that just because sometimes closing that loop, making those decisions in real event OCD when something happened, and then it's like, well, I do need to like close this loop and then move on. I wouldn't consider all of that OCD. And sometimes people do, right? So with scrupulosity, it's like, oh, well, that scripture triggered me, so I just want to never think about it again. Well, actually, maybe the exposure is like reading that scripture, figuring out where you do stand on it, which would be triggering for you to have to figure out and understand, and then moving on, versus we just avoid it altogether. So, however, real event, it looks the same way. So it feels less practical because it is more in our head, in the sense that the rituals are rumination, mental reassurance, whatever it might be, mentally reviewing, versus an external hand wash. But actually, we treat it the same way, right? Mental rituals feed OCD the same exact way that physical rituals do. And so we want to lean in, we want to approach it.
Yeah, I mean, you hit everything on the head. I'm glad you brought up that last point, because a lot of times people will say, well, if they've had other subtypes, for instance, they'll say, okay, I'm able to treat that, but because this is me just constantly being in my head. There's also a good article. I would have to find it, so maybe I'll have it for next live stream. But there was a good article on OCD, and they did some research on mental checking. And what they found is, the more that somebody with OCD tries to review an event. So what we know with real event OCD is, there was something years ago that really now is currently bothering the person. Most of the time, they don't even really, they weren't bothered in the moment, but now they're bothered years later. And what they're really wanting to do is try to get clarity on the event so that they could feel good about it and move on. But what the research shows is, the more that you try to replay that event in your head to get details, the blurrier it becomes. Why? Because you're telling yourself every time you review the past, I don't really trust my memories, and therefore I need to keep checking and checking, which in turn makes us less trusting of our memories. And then OCD is really good in going in there and kind of filling in the blanks to create a horror story. And then you feel compelled to do the compulsions. The compulsions I see with this subtype a lot is like self-hate, punishment, avoiding things, putting yourself down, feeling like crap, not really wanting to, like a loss of identity. So, for any clinicians watching, a lot of times clinicians will ask me, like, what do I do with a client with this, right? Well, what you would ask the client to do is to do something in session, working in session, like kind of recreate how this comes up for them. And what you're really working on is, instead of kind of time traveling into the past, is sort of acceptance that the event has passed, don't really remember it fully, and that's okay. If there is something practical, like Liz said, you can absolutely do that if it's values based and not compulsive. But I think for all of us with mental compulsion, we want things to be like wrapped in a pretty bow and complete, and it's not always going to be that. Sometimes you can resolve something. Sometimes there's just going to be too much doubt, and you have to finally just say to yourself, like, look, this wasn't a problem for 5 years. I've picked it up. It looks like OCD. It quacks like OCD. What if I treat it like OCD? What if I just stopped trying to figure it out and walked away from it? what would that look like? Last thing I'll say is remembering walking away from OCD doesn't mean you don't care about something. Sometimes clients will say, well, if I just walk away from my compulsions of not harming my mom, does that mean I don't care about my mom? No, it means that you simply recognize the compulsions you are doing are not getting you any closer to clarity. In fact, always remember compulsions equal confusion. So walking away from it just simply means you've recognized it hasn't been working and you don't want to continue to do something that's not working.
100%. Next question from Brittany. So Brittany asked about any residential programs. Brittany, I'm not sure what age your daughter is. We are the other full residential program in the country besides McLean and Rogers. So I work at the OCD Institute here in Texas. So we are in Houston, we're a residential and PHP program. And then of course there's other PHP options across the country. There are individuals who do housework. And so what I would look at as well is, now with I don't want to say invention because it wasn't just invented, but now with teletherapy being so accessible, it allows us to do more work at the home, even if we're teletherapy. And so I would say it's more important to find an OCD specialist and to consider teletherapy where they could do some homework virtually with your daughter while working to get her into a more intensive program. It sounds like that's what she needs. So it sounds like she would probably need residential or higher level of care. You guys can always reach out to me or Chris individually. We're always happy to answer questions. I'll do a free phone call, consult, whatever you want to give you some feedback and thoughts around what level of care you might need for your family. Okay, let's do one more question here, Chris, and then we will go to pre-submitted. So, Jonathan Seitz at 1119 said, even though the cause precipitating factors of OCD are still mysterious, what is the root issue or the most fundamental thought distortion that's at work? Certainty is a good answer. But what lies behind, I'm going to keep going. What lies behind that desire for certainty? It seems like a desire to somehow transcend one's own realistic limits at play. Rational thinking, it makes no sense that tapping onto this light pole 6 times will protect my family. What's at play in our distorted thinking?
What I really find fascinating is the brain. And from everything that I've learned, there's been a couple talks at the conferences where they focused a lot on what's going on in the brain with OCD. And what the research is, obviously, like you said, it's not fully there of it's this gene in this part of the brain, et cetera. But what we know is that people with OCD have overactive amygdalas. The amygdala is kind of like the fear center of the brain. And what's different for people with OCD than people without, I was talking to this with clients, and hopefully it's as profound to you guys as it has been to some clients. When we are in a state of panic consistently because we have an overactive brain, from our fundamental roots, if we look back on biology, if we look at all the different species on the planet, there's 2 things every species does. It reproduces and it tries to survive. So all of us as humans have this will to survive. And so our brains have this beautiful design, this kind of yin and yang of being in our rational minds, what Liz and I are in right now while we talk. And then our fight or flight brains, when we almost get hit with a car, someone's chasing us, designed to keep us safe. Well, what happens if that part of the brain that's designed to keep us safe is overactive? What if your brain is constantly telling you that there's some kind of state of danger that you're in? Well, since one of our biological kind of roots is to defend ourselves and to keep ourselves alive, our brain and our body prioritizes it. When we're in that panic state, everything gets shut down. We know it's a lot of energy for digestion, for instance. So our digestion shuts down, our blood is pumped to our muscles, we're kind of hyper focused. One exercise I have all my clients do is ask somebody that they trust, when's the last time you've been in full panic mode? And most people struggle to answer that question, or they'll remember an incident, maybe their mom got put in the hospital last May, but it's difficult for them. For us, our brains get enacted by these triggers and put us in that fight or flight state. Our brain, the limbic system, which deals with our emotions, and our amygdala are pumping. We shut down kind of the rational frontal cortex of our brain, and we go into the state of fight or flight multiple times throughout the hour. So then we think that we're keeping ourselves safe, and the compulsions is the way to do that. So that's what's really going on here. There was an article, actually, Ethan Smith, a national advocate, shared with us that typically they did find some research that people with OCD tend to struggle with certainty and can't handle uncertainty than the average person. But what's really going on here is our brains are just constantly feeling like we're in a state. I always tell my clients it's like being in Hunger Games. The clients feel like they're constantly one step away from being injured and they have to keep themselves safe. the compulsions reinforce that. We're also like misreading things, right? Like one of the things that we all do with OCD is the presence, the here and now is really hard for OCD to live in. It usually time travels in the past, kind of like real event OCD, or it goes into the future and it launches all these what ifs. And then we mistakenly treat these what if possibilities as a real possibility, and we treat it as almost like that's the likelihood. And so then we almost rationalize to ourselves why we need to do these different things. The last thing I'll kind of say is what I was telling clients is that somebody without OCD wakes up each day and just assumes things are going to go well. If they have relationship OCD, they just assume that the relationship is going to go fine and go throughout the day believing that, unless an outside source tells them something's wrong. So if their partner tells them like, hey, I'm really upset with you, or if they find, text on their phone, what we do is we wake up every day and just assume things are going to be wrong. And we constantly scan almost for validation or confirmation bias. And then we kind of create stories in our head about how things are dangerous. So if our partner doesn't text us back right away, we may know it's because they're in a big meeting, but we start to tell ourselves it's because they're cheating or don't care. So I tell my clients, what would it be like to just wake up tomorrow and just assume things are going to go right and not already start to like mentally scan, which is a compulsion. So I know that was long-winded, but there's a lot of factors at play that people experience with OCD differently than people without.
Yeah, and again, just a reminder that you have the power to change that, right? So what happens with the brain is like you having this misfiring that's telling you something's dangerous. And behaviorally, when you do a compulsion, a ritual, or avoidance, you're actually reinforcing that. So you're actually sending the signal in your brain that it is dangerous, this is scary. And so it becomes stronger and bigger. Where when we start not doing compulsions, so we start removing rituals and doing active exposures, we actually have the chance to change the signals that we're sending to our brain, and the wiring, so to say, does shift and change, right? And then it doesn't have that same power because we actually haven't empowered it, right? So think about like this line of communication that your OCD, that every time you do it, it gets more ingrained, stronger, where if we actually cut the cord, right, it can't send those same messages anymore. So they start to really shift.
Yeah, well,
I'm going to ask one more question before you hop in, because there was one in the middle of these from Jonathan Stryker at 1119. What role do you think EMDR could have in remedying CPTSD when coupled with OCD and panic disorder?
Yeah, so we know what time was that? Sorry, I was putting something on the back. Oh, I see it right here. What role?
Yeah, 1119.
Yeah. So there are a few evidence-based models or evidence-based treatments for complex PTSD and trauma. One of the things that I love that we have been talking more about at the foundation, I always think of like Caitlin Pinciotti as one of the leaders, is this concept of experience both complex PTSD and OCD. And there is going to be times that the disorders play on each other. And I do think that if somebody is experiencing that they do need to get treatment. Now, sometimes people might do both at the same time. Sometimes if their OCD is loudest or their PTSD is loudest. So EMDR is one of the treatments for complex PTSD. There's also other ones. There's PE, prolonged exposure. There's also some people I'm blanking right now. You're better at the types for panic. I mean for PTSD, but I know like people like some cognitive based therapies for PTSD. There's three.
Yeah, the three evidence-based models are cognitive processing therapy, prolonged exposure, and then EMDR is now a newer evidence-based model as well for trauma.
Yeah, so I've had clients do EMDR and really like it. I have other clients that don't, and they like the more cognitive route, or some people like the prolonged exposure because they have done ERP and they feel like it's pretty similar. So what I would say, Jonathan, is like if you are experiencing complex PTSD, it's going to impact your wellness. It's going to impact your mental health, and it potentially could impact OCD. So if you do work with two other clinicians, the only caution I'll give you, because this is what I do, is make sure your clinician is having conversations and are consulting with each other. So I always make sure that I'm never stepping on the toes of what the therapist is who's utilizing EMDR or any other evidence-based trauma strategy. I'm not stepping on their toes and they're not stepping on mine. But absolutely, I do think that if the complex PTSD is impacting you, you absolutely should get treatment. Now, sometimes, like I said, maybe based on cost or insurance, people can't do both at the same time. If you can find someone that can do both, that's always ideal. If not, what I tell clients is the OCD so loud that it's preventing you from really focusing on the PTSD? Or is it vice versa? Is it that the complex PTSD is causing you flashbacks, difficulty to sleep, high emotions, constantly breakdowns? Maybe it's time to do that first and work on the OCD after. So that would be kind of my direction on that.
All right, I'll let you go to pre-submitted for a little.
Yeah, you kind of touched on this, but maybe this question I think is a good one because sometimes people with OCD overthink everything, right? What happens to our brain if we resist the urges and intrusive thoughts? Is it dangerous? So you kind of addressed it, so maybe you could expand a little bit on that. Is getting
Yeah, so I think I want to just push a little bit that when I hear somebody say, what if I resist the urges or intrusive thoughts, it makes me think of this suppression model of like, I'm going to try to like suppress and not think about them and not have them be there. When we do that, they actually pop back up and they're louder and they keep being there. And so instead, we actually want you to kind of, we always say welcome, but a lot of people tell me like, Liz, I hate that because you're making it sound fun and enjoyable. But it's like, we want you to allow space for the intrusive thoughts, but choose to not respond to them. So the treatment is about being able to be like, oh yeah, like there you are, like this is contaminated. Oh yeah, like man, I feel like this is contaminated and I'm going to choose to do nothing about it. I'm still going to touch it and touch my phone and live my life and whatever it might be, right? So it's about being able to slow down and embrace, welcome, whatever you want to call it, but like acknowledge, process, allow space for that thought and not respond to it. If we try to like suppress the thought and not have the thought, it still has power. Because again, I want y'all to keep thinking about this simple question: what message am I sending to my brain? If we are suppressing, we're sending the message that like, I can't tolerate that, that's dangerous, I can't have that. If we are responding to it with a ritual, right, I'm going and washing my hands, throwing this can away, I'm sending the message that like, again, I can't tolerate that discomfort, I have to fix it and I have to make it go away by this compulsion. Where instead, if the message that we're sending is like, yeah, there's the thought and I'm not afraid of that thought and I'm not afraid of you and I'm going to still live my life despite the fact that that thought is there and I don't like it, I'm going to still choose to not do anything different, right? I'm going to live normally, I'm going to live the way I would if I didn't have OCD. Now all of a sudden the message we're sending is that you don't have power, right? I'm not giving you power. You don't have power, and I'm not responding to you like you're powerful.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add is in 2015, UCLA did a study and they found like pre and post a 3-week intensive. And what they found is people who had OCD, actually their brain didn't respond to negative stimuli in the same way. And over time, the brains almost looked closer to a brain without OCD than with OCD. So I would say quite the opposite to the answer of, or to the question that was originally asked, is no. Doing treatment and working through OCD actually doesn't cause any kind of damage to the brain. It's quite the opposite. People start to notice that their brain pathways, their neural pathways, are more aligned to behavior that they did prior to the OCD taking over and much more similar to their friends and family who don't. So I always tell people nobody ever gets better and then turns around and is like, man, I really, really wish I could go back to the way it was, both brain-wise or
no, thank you. Yeah.
Wise, yeah. The second one I like because there was a question early on at 9:09 about interested in the topic of finding your real self with an OCD diagnosis. And so then we received a question pre-submitted that says, if you could put it up there, Brennan, it says, where can we learn more about acceptance and commitment therapy? So I felt like it was a good fusion. So maybe can you talk a little bit about how you, as a person with OCD, how did you finally find Liz? Like, what were some of the tools? ACT helped me, so I could talk about it if it didn't help you, but what are some of the tools specifically to the original question at 12:09? How did you find yourself despite having an OCD diagnosis, Liz?
Oh man, I'm gonna put the gratitude there onto my parents. But I got really lucky that my parents were really strict on the fact that if I was struggling, I had to be in treatment. And I had to be doing something. So whether that was work, volunteer, or school, my parents always required me to have some sort of full-time-ish activity. And their reasoning for that was that we do not want to send the message that because you have OCD, you can't do these other things. And so I'm really grateful for that, you guys. You will hear me saying, like, I don't believe in accommodations as a long-term strategy. I don't, right? Because I want to send the message that, yeah, you can have OCD and you can be fully capable of living an amazing life and like not having your OCD be loud. And we don't want to send the message that because I have OCD, I can't live the life I want, or that I can't be somebody I want to be down the road. And so thankfully, because my parents required me to keep pushing through, I feel like I had to make decisions around school and my career despite having OCD. And it was so good for me because it made me kind of continue to set goals and understand who I was and figure out along the way, which then in turn really helped me fight my OCD. And as I started to enter my career and have relationships and have friendships and, you know, figure out things I enjoyed to do for fun and things I don't enjoy to do, I feel like that actually allowed me to push my OCD so much more, because now I had these greater good reasons for fighting OCD versus like, oh, let me fight OCD first and then figure out who I am. And so I would encourage you to start figuring out who you are while your OCD is even loud. Don't be afraid of that. You know, when I hear patients here in our residential leaving and they'll say things to me like, well, I can't work full time yet. I'm like, well, why? And they're like, oh, because of my OCD. And I'm like, well, that's not true. Like, you absolutely can work full time. And if you work full time, it will actually cause you to have a bigger reason to fight your OCD than if you aren't working because you just want to address OCD, and then you have actually more space and room for OCD. And so my answer to people is always make life bigger than OCD. And the more we keep making life bigger and figuring out who we are and what we love and what drives us and where our passions are, the more we're going to be willing to do that hard work of fighting our OCD, because our passions are here and loud. But if we don't make those loud, it's really hard to fight OCD. And so what I would say is, for me, figuring out who I was like a part of my journey. After treatment, I started to re-engage with things I hadn't done in years. I was able to have so much of my life back, right? Little things like being able to take a 15-minute shower, or these activities that used to, you know, be so dreadful that I could easily do. I had so much more free time, and I had to figure out who I was. I had to understand what I loved and what I liked. And guess what, guys? That keeps shifting. It's not like I figured that out in the first year and then I had it solved. Like, now I'm a mom and my life looks very different, and the things I enjoy with my family are very different than what I enjoyed when I was single. And, you know, so it keeps shifting in your life, and it's supposed to be, and you should keep figuring out who you are, and you should continue to set the goal that I want to make my life, I want to make my purpose bigger than OCD every day of my life.
Yeah, really, really well said from only somebody who has lived it can say. And I would add to the question about acceptance commitment therapy. You know, Liz and I just did a recent live stream with Marisa Maza, and she talks a lot about acceptance and commitment therapy. In addition to, she has an acceptance and commitment therapy workbook. I know Lisa Coyne and Evie Gould, who's on OCD SoCal's board, both of them really put out some stuff on acceptance and commitment therapy. So definitely look at Lisa Coyne and all that she's doing. At the conferences, there was a good talk by Marisa Maza, but there's always good acceptance of commitment therapy talks. Michael Tuig has really led how to use ACT for OCD. So there's a lot of good resources out there. If you go to iocf.org, you'll also find a lot of ACT resources. And I think the reason acceptance and commitment therapy has been a welcome adjunct to OCD treatment is because OCD does sometimes take away our identity. We start to lose ourselves. I think about when I was getting all the harm thoughts around my own family, when protecting my family is such a huge role in me, I started to question my very importance and existence, right? So we do want to start to rediscover who we are and really connect with the things that make us unique and important. It makes it really harder for OCD to sort of like sabotage or smear us when we're really clear on who we are in the first place. All right, I'm going to ask one last piece submitted, and then I know we can jump back to live. This came from a teacher, and she wanted to ask the question, if you could put it up, Brennan, is how can teachers be either trained or assist students with OCD at school? So what would be a good way for a teacher to learn how to support their students with OCD?
This is a great question. So I have a couple thoughts. First and foremost, I just want to remind you that if you are not a licensed clinician, we really don't want you to act as one. So we want you to be thoughtful about, how can I be a supportive teacher but not feel like you have to go into being a therapist or a clinician. And I say the same for parents, right? I want you to be a supportive mom, but I don't want you to become a clinician, right? You don't want to have to get in that fight and battle with the kids of pushing them to do clinical work. That's for them and their clinical team to be doing. So that's the first step is, to remember that you are not expected to be a full clinician, but how can you learn to provide appropriate support? This is such a great question. The second piece is I want you to work with the child's clinical team. So we want you to be having calls with their clinician, with their school counselor, with their parents on a consistent basis to understand that child's treatment and to make sure that you're supporting and guiding them effectively. That clinician should be helping you understand what that looks like, right? For some patients, we might need more accommodations early on. For some, we're already reducing it to less. We want your support to look much more minimal than it was at the beginning, so you want to be working with their clinical team. And then the last and most important resource is to please check out anxietyintheclassroom.org. Chris, Brendan, if you could put that up, that would be great. Anxietyintheclassroom.org is an incredible website that was built by the IOCDF and incredible leaders within our foundation. And it is a wonderful website and tool that has sections for parents, it has sections for teachers and sections for individuals. But as teachers, you can go to this website to learn more about how to effectively provide support, provide help, resources, and to also guide your students or families to the right treatment. So what does that look like? So that is called anxietyintheclassroom.org. All right, next question I want us to hop into. So it is from, let's see, first of all, I love y'all's comments. Y'all are so sweet. Both Matt and Amy, so many people just saying that you've really made that transition into freedom, and we just absolutely love to hear that. So
and quick shout out to Matt and Amy. I mean, trust me, Liz and I think one of the things about us advocates, Ethan included, Katie and stuff, we have these meetings every other Tuesday, and we always talk about y'all. I promise it's good, but we really, really recognize all the hard work that advocates are putting in. We really respect advocates, and advocates help make the OCD community what it is. So people like Amy, people like Matt, people that come to these things and are posting things, and Amy does a lot of stuff on Facebook and resources and stuff. Please just know that Liz and I see it. We are two advocates, but we cannot do it alone. So we need people out there on the out there supporting. So I just wanted to shout them out because they're always so great in what they do.
So amazing. Love it. Next question is at 1126 from Super Duper. How do I know if I need to see a therapist for OCD or GAD? What's the difference between a constant anxious thought or compulsions from an obsession? For example, what if I go crazy? This is a great question. Chris, you want to take it?
Yeah, so when we look at the difference between obsessive compulsive disorder and general anxiety disorder, typically general anxiety disorder, if somebody who experiences that was to talk to friends and family about their experience, a lot of people would nod along. I really struggle at work because I have to present in front of my team and I get very anxious and my throat gets dry. Ooh, I'm really worried because it's raining and there's traffic and I'm a little bit worried about traffic. It's sort of like what I always tell people is it's like getting a text every once in a while versus OCD is like constant text messages, emails, etc. So it's not that I don't like to ever compare mental health disorders. I don't want to say one is tougher than the other. It's just generalized anxiety disorder is kind of what's in the title, right? It's having this sort of like heightened sense of anxiety around things that we typically hear that may not bother other people or they may have anxiety. The difference between OCD is that we have these intrusive obsessions. We start to have almost these beliefs about ourselves that really make us susceptible to triggers, right? If I have the trigger of what if I go crazy, right? That obsession pops in. A key component of OCD is the C. I'm going to start to do compulsions in the form of mental, physical, or avoidance compulsions to try to prove that I won't go crazy or prevent myself from it. It's a constant reinforced cycle. Whereas somebody with generalized anxiety may have a little bit of a health scare. Maybe their sister just got diagnosed with cancer and they're worried about themselves. People with OCD have these irrational subtypes, and also, people with generalized anxiety typically are anxious about something in front of them or coming up. People with OCD can be anxious about things that have no correlation with their character. So somebody with OCD might think they're blasphemous, but may be somebody who's absolutely devout. So the OCD has an ability to really kind of start to get people to question the very essence of their being. The good news, and I'll let Liz jump in as well, but the good news is all of us who have worked with OCD have also been extensively trained in the treatment of generalized anxiety disorder and other anxiety disorders, like what's social anxiety disorder are known as social phobia. So the good thing is typically if you find an OCD specialist, if you're experiencing both, and what if I go crazy, I typically see that much more with OCD, they can work on both. It's not always the other way around. Somebody who's trained with treating generalized anxiety disorder is not always trained in OCD treatment. So you're probably safer going the OCD route.
And just remember that the big difference between GAD and OCD is that often GAD is much more focused on everyday worries and fears, where OCD is more focused on bizarre content. So the thought of going crazy feels much more a little bit like OCD to me, just because it's not a fear that most people have, right? It's bizarre in nature. And as Chris said, anybody who specializes in OCD is going to be able to treat GAD. Somebody who says they treat GAD may not be able to treat OCD. So great questions. Residential programming. So I will take those ones. So when do you know it's time for residential treatment? So there's two key indicators. The first one I would say is if you're seeing a clinician and they're recommending a higher level of care, follow their guidance. If you're seeing a specialist who treats OCD, like Chris treats OCD on an outpatient level, he is going to recommend to his patient if he doesn't think that they can make the progress they need to be making in this level of care. So often that means you're going to try outpatient for a little bit, but the treatment isn't sticking. The individuals are not able to do their homework in between sessions. They really need that additional support. Residential, unlike other programs like PHP or IOP, is 24-hour support. So most of our patients who need residential over PHP are patients who need after-hours support. So support showering, support brushing their teeth, support with food making, right? That sort of preparation that we can give them in that 24-hour support level of care, versus somebody who is really fully functioning and isn't necessarily ritualizing in the evenings and other times and could do a day program and then they could maintain their progress, or somebody who can do outpatient where they can go a few times or once a week and maintain progress in between. So I would think about two things. Number one, is their clinician recommending that? If so, follow their lead. And number two, is the support that they need much more than what can be offered in that outpatient setting? So do they need after-hours support? Are they not able to do their homework and follow through on their treatment recommendations after they leave that therapy session? And so if so, they may need more intense programming up front. There are not any residential OCD specific programs that I know of in Canada. So the three full residential programs in the country, in the world that I know of that are OCD specific are our program, OCDI, Texas, Boston McLean, OCDI in Boston. So that's McLean's program, and then Rogers Memorial in Wisconsin. And then, of course, there's other programs like Shepherd Pratt and Neurobehavioral Institute and PCH that have some residential support and some residential programs that treat OCD, but may not be only OCD specific programs, but are also wonderful. So lots of options available. You can go to iocdf.org to learn more about intensive programs that are available. Okay, so many good questions. I'm trying to think of where we should pause. So, Chris, why don't we stop with just final takeaways and feedback that you think would be really important? So many of you guys giving great feedback. Yes, you can watch all of these lives afterwards on our YouTube. Thank you so much for y'all's wonderful comments and questions. But yeah, so many people talking about making life bigger, practicing ERP, which then exposes OCD lies, and identifying and addressing core fears. This is huge. We've done a live stream on this. Love that so many of you are looking forward to figuring out who you are. Does IOCDF maintain a list of attorneys for legal planning with special needs? I do believe we have a section on the IOCDF website for ADA resources and support and like legal stuff. So I would definitely check that out and get some things that you can answer. Chris, I'm going to have you end with this question from Matt at 11:53. A quick question. I've tried submitting for the Orlando conference for a proposal with visual Tourettic OCD, but the form only lets me apply for being a host speaker and one co-host speaker only. Is there a way to apply to have a panel for the submission? You're both absolute rock stars and Maverick experts. Big shout out to you both for helping me.
Yeah, Matthew, I'll have to find out on the back end. The only time it allows you to only submit as like a speaker and a host speaker and one Co-host is for the support groups or evening activities. So unless there's something faulty with the submission process, what I would double check, I'm not saying you're wrong, but what I'm saying is I would double check to see if you're trying to submit it as a support group or an evening activity. It only allows two people to submit that together. What I will say is, let's say four people wanted to submit a support group together. Pick two of the people to submit it as the host and the co-host, and then the other two people can still attend, help run. Sometimes support groups break out into smaller groups, but for an actual proposal submission for the in-person conference, you can submit 5 people on a proposal. So I would double check to make sure you didn't accidentally submit it for the wrong thing, because it should be 5.
That's right. So what you'll want to do is you'll want to click proposal, and then it should give you an option to choose 5 speakers that you can either input their stuff or choose if they're already in the portal. But you can always go to iocdf.org and call their number at the bottom for support. But let's give a quick plug. Chris, why don't you share with everybody what Matt is talking about and what the conference proposals and system is and why they should consider submitting something?
Yeah, we did a really good live stream last week with Steph from the foundation and Jesse from the Young Adults Special Interest Group. One of the key kind of, I think, of like the cornerstones of the International OCD Foundation is their conferences. Please go back and look at that, because there's not just the in-person online anymore. We have the BDD conference coming March 16th. We have the kids conference, which is coming next weekend, the kids camp. So there's a lot of good stuff. We have a faith in OCD, a hoarding conference. There's a lot of really good things that you can attend. What Matthew's talking about is this July. I'm going to be butchered because the dates changed the normal July. I know it's towards the end of July. Liz will look up the dates, but we're having our in-person conference in Orlando, and the
July 26th through the 28th.
Yeah, July 26th through 28th. And I always say it's a little bit before that, because you can come in a little early. There's Thursday night activities, but it's a chance to really meet some of the experts in person. And what I love about this conference and who goes, if you see somebody speak on a topic you like, you can go up, you can approach them, you can have a conversation with them, and they're really supportive. The conference is also, we want to hear your voices. And so people can submit a proposal, and you don't have to be a professional. There's people with lived experience that are proposing. There are parents that propose submissions and really want to talk about the role of parents. Teachers can submit a proposal about what they find is helpful in class and not in class, etc. So make sure to look at the proposal process, and please, 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 if you can, join us. If coming to an in-person conference just is out of your budget or just not something you can do, I believe in November is going to be our online OCD conference. And so that's an option to have the same experience, but virtually. But we'd love to have your voices. So please submit.
Yes. It is so good to see y'all. I love being back. I'm so excited. I know in 2024, Chris and I both have the goal to make sure we're answering a ton of questions live. So that's something we're going to keep doing, from both pre-submitted and live questions. If you have content or questions you want to submit in advance, you can go to iocdf.org/peace of mind. Otherwise, we're just so excited to be here and to share this space with you. It's truly an honor for both Chris and I to be able to share our experience, our professional experience, in the hopes that we can help you guys in some way. So love connecting, love being here. Chris, I'll give it to you.
Yeah, just to echo that, I mean, we have meetings every other Tuesday that we talk about the live programming, and we definitely are always working hard, finding guests, etc. But one thing Liz and I want to make sure is that we do have some of these Ask the Experts that are solely just to answer your questions, because we know that I remember reading a statistic that there's only about 2,000 trained clinicians in all of the United States on OCD treatment, but only about 500 of those really continue with education and make it their predominant focus. And so spreading 550 states, I hate math. So I just know that that's not a lot of people per state. And now when we look at an international scope, there's even less. And so we know that a lot of you are on wait lists or trying to find people. And although we can't replace therapy, our goal, Liz and I, is to at least give you some hope, some education, some resources and direction to hold you over, because we know you and your loved ones are struggling. But Liz and I never take this for granted. We appreciate we can only do this with all of you here. And one thing I always do afterwards is I go through, and any question we just didn't get to because of time, I put on those pre-submitted. And sometimes when we have time, we answer those and put them on the IOCDF's YouTube. So if we didn't answer your question, I promise it wasn't ignoring you. We just get an influx from all the different socials of IOCDF, and we're trying to do it best we can. But we will definitely answer them at some point. And make sure to join us every Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern or 9 a.m. Pacific time on the West Coast.
See you guys as we're signing off. Cloudy, I will say that I love Kim Quinlan's book. It is a self-help workbook for OCD, and I love John Abramowitz and John Hirschfield's self-help OCD books, so feel free to look those up. So you can look up Kim Quinlan, John Hirschfield, John Abramowitz OCD workbook, and you'll find them. Thanks, y'all.